Hey there all you creeps and critters, I'm Hushpup, and welcome to my channel, where we take a look at spooky games of all shapes and sizes, and I give you some of my thoughts and opinions on them. Today's video will be the first in a series covering one of my favorite gaming franchises,
Resident Evil.
I've been really excited to review this series as it has some of my all-time favorite games in it. It also has a few entries that are complete dog shit, but we'll discuss those another time. For clarity, let me quickly explain how I will be covering this series.
I'm only going to be playing through the numbered entries, opting for the most modern version of each game when possible, so don't expect any spin-offs or older versions, at least for now. I will also be skipping over any DLC, as I have special plans for those in a later video. And final disclaimer, in the interest of shaking things up a bit, I'm going to be working my way backwards through the franchise. I'm choosing to do this for a couple reasons, but mainly, I just wanted to do it that way.
Any questions? Good. Now that we have all that housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about, spoiler alert, one of my favorite games, not only of the Resident Evil variety, but maybe of all time. That's right, today we're taking a look at Resident Evil Village. I'm sure some of you remember when this game was released, as it made quite a splash on the internet thanks to one character in particular, Lady Dimitrescu.
Oh, they're coming!
Once the smoke had cleared and everyone moved past thirsting over that tall cluster of ones and zeros,
They're coming again!
the world finally got to experience the game in its entirety, and it was received pretty positively overall. Now, I originally played Village a few months after it was released, and I was absolutely blown away. I, like many others, was surprised that despite being featured prominently in the marketing, Lady D and her castle make up only about a quarter of the game. As time has gone on, I've had some slight changes of opinion on how well certain aspects of this game work, but more on that later. For now, let's get into it and turn off the lights, stock up on ammo, grab some first aid bottles, and fire up
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil Village takes place a year or so after the events of RE7. We resume our role as the world's unluckiest mold, Ethan Winters. Following their harrowing escape from the Baker household, Ethan and his wife Mia have rebuilt their life and started a family. The game opens with Mia reading a creepy little fairy tale to their infant daughter, Rose. It's in this macabre little pop-up book that we get some cryptic foreshadowing as to what to expect from this game's story. A lost child, a ragtag group of creatures with sinister intentions, and a journey through a twisted world that would be right at home in a Brothers Grimm collection. After we take a quick tour around their new home, we sit down with Mia for an evening meal. From the few minutes that we spend watching the couple interact, it's quite clear that the vibes are off. Before we are able to get much more context behind this strained relationship, the argument is interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and the whizzing of a passing
Tamara,
bullet.
you are so...
We look at Mia as she stares out the window in disbelief. Then, in a split second, the power goes out, and we watch as our wife is gunned down before our very eyes. After the gunfire lets up, in walks series favorite Chris Redfield. Ethan, shocked and bewildered by what he has just witnessed, yells out in anger at Chris. Without any explanation, Chris pulls out a pistol and continues to unload several more shots into Mia. We then are forced at gunpoint to walk towards the front door. Several masked men are now searching the house as we walk towards the entrance. We hear the cries of our daughter, Rose, and we look to our left. There she is, wrapped in a blanket and being handed to Chris. Ethan screams out in anger and lunges forward at Chris, who barely even reacts at all. After a brief surge of resistance, we are knocked out from a blow to the back of the head. In a brief dream sequence, we speak to our now deceased wife, but are abruptly awakened. Engulfing us is a dark, snowy forest littered with the wreckage of a transport van and the bodies of a few masked men from earlier. It is here that our journey down this dark rabbit hole begins. Now, if you've never played any of the games in this series, the opening events come off as quite shocking and tragic. However, if you have played the other entries, specifically Resident Evil 7, these scenes are shocking for a completely different and somewhat laughable reason. I will not explain in much detail, as even though this and RE7 have been out for several years at this point, I want to keep things relatively spoiler-free in case there is anyone who would like to experience the story for themselves. All I will say is that everything is not what it seems. When you really break it down, Resident Evil Village is a first-person shooter trapped in a horror game's body. Now, by no means am I saying that this game is light on scares, but it's one of the more action-oriented entries in this series. When Village came out, I remember some critics saying it was more like Call of Duty than a Resident Evil game. I've got to say, I don't agree with that sentiment, but I can see why some might look at it that way. In my opinion, its action is more in line with that of the Metro series. While there is quite a bit of gunning down enemies, I still feel like it has enough elements of the quote-unquote classic Resident Evil games. In fact, one of my favorite characteristics of Village is how well it strikes this balance. It's a game of two sides that I think complement each other pretty well. You do have a decent selection of weapons that you can upgrade at the Duke's shop, and ammo is readily available. However, up until the final hours of the game, it still feels like you need to make your shots count. You don't really ever need to run from a fight, but you should approach each encounter somewhat cautiously, especially on your first playthrough. In my opinion, the combat never really feels comfortable, and I mean that in a good way. It feels smooth, but not smooth enough to allow you to go into autopilot. It's hard to describe, but it has just enough jankiness to keep you on edge. On top of that, I think the designs and the unpredictable movements of your enemies keep the more action-packed segments feeling tense. What I'm really trying to say is that, regardless of how powerful you seem at times, it often feels like you're frantically scraping by. There are plenty of moments where you're seconds away from missing a crucially important shot or taking a hit that puts you dangerously low on health supplies. The other side of this coin are the puzzle and exploration elements. I will admit that compared to the earlier games in the series, the puzzles are very easy to figure out. In fact, there isn't really anything that I would consider a puzzle per se. It's less about figuring out what you're supposed to do and more about locating the correct item in order to proceed. There are these cool miniature obstacle courses that you can find throughout the world where you have to guide a ball through each level by tilting the course. Again, these aren't really traditional puzzles as there's nothing to really figure out, but they are a fun little extra to search for. Where I think Village really pays homage to its roots is in the exploration. Just like most of the other entries, there is backtracking to be done, and there are things you can miss if you aren't paying attention. Whether that's a valuable resource, a powerful new gun, or a lost object that leads you to one of the game's many optional treasures, you definitely are rewarded for going off the beaten path. There's also some decent optional boss fights to be seen, so it goes beyond just finding some extra goodies. Nothing is very hard to figure out, but you do have to put in some effort if you want to see all that this world has to offer. Another aspect I enjoyed was the inventory management in this game. This is one feature that I've heard many criticize, as it is quite forgiving. If I'm being honest, I'm not the biggest fan of how the earlier games make you handle your inventory. That being said, I also feel like some of the later games in the franchise take things a bit too far in the other direction. I find the way Village handles inventory management quite appealing, as it feels like a good balance between two extremes. This mechanic, like many others in this entry, is heavily inspired by the approach Resident Evil 4 takes. If you're not familiar, all of your items must fit into a case that is represented as a 5x9 grid. You are free to move items around as you see fit in order to pack it as efficiently as possible. As the game progresses, you can choose to pay in order to make the grid larger, thus giving you more room to store items. I will say that about halfway through the game, you reach a point where it is pretty unlikely that you will run out of room. Regardless of how forgiving it does become, I did enjoy this nod to RE4. There's just something so endlessly satisfying about being able to perfectly organize your case for maximum storage. I would say that hands down my favorite quality of this game is the variety it brings to the table. I wouldn't say that it's a long game, but it packs your playthrough with several unique environments and enemies. Upon release, people were divided on the enemy types that we encounter. This is mainly because it is vastly different from what we see in the typical RE game. But that's actually what I really enjoyed about it. Instead of your usual zombies and occasional scientific abomination, we get monsters that we don't often see in video games. Lycans, vampires, trolls, possessed dolls. These are all unique in my opinion. I think the different environments that we go through also do their part in keeping things fresh. My favorite section, which also has some of my favorite enemy encounters in the game, is Heisenberg's factory. Whoops, wrong picture. I'm not sure what led Capcom to create a character with the same name as the widely iconic Breaking Bad anti-hero, but name faux pas aside, this area strikes all the right chords with me. I think the layout is vast but not confusing, the enemies and their origin story are disturbing, and the combat encounters are pure adrenaline.
I am the danger.
The last positive I'd like to talk about are the scares. Now, I must admit that when I originally played through Resident Evil Village, I thought it was one of the scariest games I had played. As time has gone on, its scare factor has dropped a couple levels for me, but I still think it is one of the scariest games in the franchise, with only a couple others surpassing it. I know that may be a slightly controversial take, but there are several scenes that have really stuck with me over the years. There's one section in particular that I dread replaying every time, and if you're familiar with this game, you know exactly which part I'm talking about. I think one reason the game is so scary to me is, once again, because of the variety. See, there are so many different types of horror thrown at you that if one part doesn't get under your skin, most likely another one will later on. I myself don't find the thought of werewolves and sexy vampire ladies all that frightening, but walking down dark hallways, avoiding unspeakable terrors that play on the fear of losing a child, yeah, that gets to me. As I hinted at previously, I also find the atmosphere and enemies in the factory quite unnerving. There's something about the idea of being the subject of some mad scientist's twisted experiments that truly creeps me out. The reveal of Propeller Head is a great example of this. The way the game hints at what's to come way before you meet the boss just keeps you on edge. You can't help but wonder what kind of fucked up monstrosity lies in wait for you.
Shut your fucking hole! Sorry about that.
Now we're on to the things I disliked about Resident Evil Village. Now, as I said at the beginning of this review, Village just might be one of my favorite games ever. That being said, there are two pretty big issues with this game that, especially when replaying it for this review, were really hard for me to ignore. First off, the story of this game is just comically bad. It's an example of how a sequel can truly ruin the events of its predecessor. As I said previously, I'm not going to spoil where the plot specifically goes, but I can't iterate enough how little sense the story and the actions of certain characters make. If this was a standalone game, it would be crazy, but somewhat better. However, with the context of the previous entry, even the opening scenes of Village are just ridiculous. Now, I am still able to greatly enjoy this game, but especially on this last playthrough, I couldn't help but notice this pretty glaring flaw. My one other critique of Resident Evil Village has to do with the main protagonist himself.
Ethan.
Ethan.
You see, Capcom goes out of their way to make Ethan as generic as possible. You're basically playing as the great value version of Alan Wake. I mean, Ethan Winters is truly the least wonderful loaf of Wonder Bread you've ever met. He's the whitest glass of skim milk you've ever seen. He's a pizza without any sauce, cheese, or toppings. He's a movie that's nothing but the ending credits. He's the expired sleeping pill you find in the medicine cabinet, but you take it anyway, because why the fuck not? He's the beer that you buy, only to realize when you get home that it's non-alcoholic.
What?
He is the faceless cardboard cutout that you stand behind to take touristy pictures at Six Flags. All joking aside, I think the fact that the developers purposely avoid showing Ethan's face says it all. Even though he is supposed to be an actual written character with a backstory, he is presented as a faceless, insipid dude that literally could be anyone. I understand that this was most likely done in order to make the player feel like they are Ethan Winters, but if that's the case, I just don't think that Capcom pulls off what they're going for. If you're going to give a character a name and a backstory, if you're going to make them the main character for 2 full-length games, you've got to give them a personality and something that makes them feel like an actual person, and at the bare minimum, a face.
First flight of the orbital Discovery, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
And here we are, at the final portion of the video, where I rate the game on 2 separate scales. The first is measuring the overall quality of the game, based on things like controls, story, art style, polish, fun factor, and any other general aspects of the game itself. The second is the one and only This is where I'll tell you just how scary I thought the game was. Both scores are on a scale of 10, so the higher the number, the better. In summary, I thought Resident Evil Village was a great roller coaster ride through a crazy fairy tale landscape. It explored several new concepts that other entries in the RE series have yet to do. Even after a few playthroughs, I found the enemy and the environmental variety fresh, the combat tense and engaging, and the exploration, while not mandatory, was enticing enough for me to search every corner of the map for extra items and content. At the time of this review, you can pick up this game for $39.99, and I believe that's a great price, especially since this series has a pretty heavy emphasis on replay value, including features like extra modes and a new Game Plus option. Even if that's not something that interests you, this specific playthrough took me a little over 11 hours, and in my eyes, that's a decent value for your dollar. When looking at the negatives, I really disliked the story of this game, especially when put into the context with the events of RE7. It was to the point that during this playthrough, I basically just zoned out during all the cutscenes, because there were very few plot points that I could take seriously. I also thought the way that Capcom handled the characterization of the protagonist was bland and just lacking overall. After it's all said and done though, this is still one of my favorite games of recent memory, and definitely one of my top 3 in the Resident Evil series. Call it nostalgia, call it bias, but regardless of my pretty huge critiques of this game, I'm still going to give it a 9 out of 10. I also feel that this is one of the scarier games to come out in the last several years. Not every scene is terrifying, and some are even a bit on the comedic side, but there were more than a handful that stuck with me even years after my first playthrough. When I decided to replay and review this game for this video, I dreaded redoing certain segments just because of how scary I remembered them being. While time and repetition has definitely lessened the impact of some of these scares, I'm going to give Resident Evil Village a 7.5 out of 10 on the And that's how the vampire-infested castle crumbles. Those are my thoughts on Resident Evil Village. Have you played this or any of the other entries in the Resident Evil series? If so, what did you think? How do you feel about the story and some of the directions it goes? Did you find this game scary, or is it just mindless action? And lastly, what games would you like me to look at in the future? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what I'm doing here, hit that like button and go ahead and subscribe while you're at it. It really helps the channel out and is greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching, and until next time.